Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. This is a new access record of 63 participants. Woohoo! Welcome, everybody, from all 8 cities across Europe and anywhere else. And welcome especially to our guest speaker for this morning, Bill Thompson. I'm not going to tell you about Bill Thompson's career and who he is, because he can do that better himself. And it is such a vast and varied career across so many major institutions that I couldn't do it justice. But Bill is an expert on the internet, if I had to put it in 3 words. And is someone I've enjoyed working with in many, many contexts, and I'm hoping that you will enjoy working with him in future too. Bill is very open to Twitter and Facebook and all other sort of social media friends. So this is the start of a conversation. I'm going to hand over to you now, Bill, to present and then lead us all in discussion on digital inclusion.
Okay, just to say, Susanna seems to be both in the waiting room and in the meeting at the moment. So I don't know who the admin is, needs to sort that out. I've got somebody sitting in the waiting room, I can see that. Thank you for the introduction, Rebecca. I enjoyed listening to the last bit about the IAP. I found it deeply reassuring, and I don't even have to prepare one. So, you know, it was just helping on just in terms of a personal therapy level. So thank you for that. I'm going to share my screen, if I may. And I'm going to try to do it. There it is. Okay. Share sound, optimize for video clip. And I'm going to try to use the beta feature on. No, it's not going to work. Okay, I'm not going to use the beta feature because it's going to have to be the basic. It's just going to have to see me on the side. You should have my slide and a picture of me looking slightly disgruntled. My wife said, "What were you thinking when they took that photo?" And I suspect I was in yet another Zoom call with a bunch of people, and it was just reflecting my view. Fortunately, today's a lot more entertaining than the normal ones. Yeah, as Rebecca said, I'm a technology writer and a journalist, really, and I present a program called Digital Planet on BBC World Service. And I've been working in, on and around the network since the mid-1980s. So I've seen it grow from being a research and academic network into the monster it is today, the all-consuming monster it is today. And I helped set up the UK's first commercial internet service provider. I built the first website for the Guardian newspaper in the UK, and also did websites for people like members of parliament and stuff like that. And I've worked with lots of arts and cultural organisations over the years on their digital strategies. I was on the board of the National Centre for Writing in Norwich in the UK, Britain Symphonia, and of course, most notably with Rebecca, I was the digital director of the Cambridge Film Festival for several years, where we put the film festival online, including live streaming from the bar on a Nokia N95 phones, and the first ever live Q&A with a director who was in California, this was Bruce Weber, done entirely using sort of consumer grade technology, a Mac, iChat, and a commercial internet connection instead of £20,000 worth of satellite kit. So we've had a lot of fun, and I've been doing this for a while. I realized that in 1986-87, I was the chair of something called the Community Computing Network. And our ambition was to get at least one personal computer in every charity in the UK. Right? We thought that was a good goal. If every charity, however big they were, had at least one computer in it, then we'd have done well. So I've been thinking about digital inclusion for a while, but also the nature of what we call digital inclusion has, of course, changed a lot in that time. I have to do that, do I? So I should have shown that slide earlier. So these are all my old phones. This is my history in hardware, right back to one of the very first ones I had. That's how long I've been playing this game. I learned about access, I have to confess, through Rebecca asking me to come and talk to you. And it's been really interesting to see what you've all achieved so far and how the work on widening participation, decentralization and getting more from data has informed your practice. And it was obvious in our conversations that the idea of digital inclusion is implicit. It's basically part of what you do already. And that makes perfect sense because all 8 cities are far past what you call the digital revolution. You know, you're already on the other side of it. Here in Western countries, particularly here in the modern European economy, internet access is not quite pervasive. There's still, as we're going to talk about, lots of people who are not online. But the idea of being online, the idea of online services and stuff like that, the idea of digital connectivity is just core to how we run the economy, run our cities, and increasingly run our culture. Very few cultural products these days are made without the use of email, word processors, infinite numbers of PowerPoint decks that no one wants to read, Zoom calls, Miro, all those sorts of things. And so it just sits at the center of what you're up to. Of course, it's possible to be digitally excluded as well. And this is a very nice example from the UK. In the UK, the NHS set up this system called Test and Trace, where you had to scan a barcode to register in a place. This was when we were slightly more open than we currently are. And it became a bit like no shirt, no shoes, no phone, no service, because venues would exclude people who could not check in. And so if you didn't have a fairly modern smartphone, if you didn't have the appropriate app, you weren't allowed to actually use a public venue. And that seemed to me a bit of a miscalculation, shall we say, particularly at a time when we were all trying to work together to confront this pandemic. Nonetheless, and even through lockdown, the work hasn't stopped. This is a friend of mine, Marcus Roma, who is still in theatres making work, just appropriately masked and face shielded and stuff like that. So it's not like everything stopped because we've gone through COVID-19. It's more that COVID-19 has driven our thinking. It's made network access, it's made some degree of digital inclusion a vital issue. And although that's largely been driven, I have to say, by commercial considerations, you know, it's been the employers who've been desperate to have people be able to work from home because they can't come into the office. It's been government wanting to keep the economy going. And I know different governments have dealt with this in different ways, some better than others. But from my perspective here in the UK, shall we say, the degree of respect shown to the cultural economy has not been high. Let's just leave it at that. We can have that. We'd have the conversation. What that has done is to highlight what I would argue the many limitations in all of these tools. What it's shown us is basically that these things are not necessarily fit for purpose in many different ways. And that has affected directly the ways cultural organizations think. Because once you start thinking about the impact of lockdown in various countries, when you start thinking about the impact on venues being able to open or what capacity they can have, when you start thinking about the effect on freelance workers and all those sorts of things, you look to these tools to try to make things better. You look to them to think they'll solve the problem. And what people have found is they don't solve the problem, or they don't necessarily solve the problem. They have clearly resulted in quite a lot of creative expression within the constraints. So here's one from the BBC that you may have seen, which I particularly like. I'll just show you 30 seconds of this, but you can find it on the BBC website. Bunch of dancers in their baths. Who'd have thought it'd be tribute? So that I really like, because it's just an example of how you can take advantage of the fact that lots of people have cameras with smartphones, they know what they're doing, they can perform, and you can set something up and film it. And there are thousands of examples of this out there, of people using the opportunity to think differently. And I like that one, in particular because it made its way onto like mainstream media. It was on the BBC. So it wasn't just sitting on someone's website, it got an audience. There's also been people who have reflected on the technological inequalities. This is something that actually came before lockdown, but it struck me, which is BIT Habitat in Barcelona were commissioned this thing called the Analog Museum of the Digital Inequality. And it was an attempt to represent digital inequality as pastiches or parodies or extensions of traditional art forms, and to show the digital divide. So we have paintings, we have maps, we have a replica of the Rosetta Stone that's about email and translations emails. And my personal favorite is this one that's just coming up now, which is a map of the world that shows digital connectivity, but illustrated in a very old-fashioned format. And I think for me, this idea that we can reflect the state of the world in our artistic practice to challenge it, and then also in our artistic practice, oh, somebody's doing something. Oh, that's me. Huh. Okay, I filmed more than I thought with that one. And that we can reflect the work in our artistic practice and also then seek to change the world through that artistic practice is really important. And then what matters is that when we think about digital inclusion, we think about it, if you like, from a broad perspective. So it's more than simply having access, right? The definition that I use for digital inclusion is about the benefits of internet and digital technologies, and making sure those benefits are available to everyone so they can make the most of what is on offer. And that's not just being online. It also, to me, speaks of being invited into something, being welcomed, feeling and being seen in those spaces. Somebody needs to mute, I think. I think it's Veronica. And what we want to do today, or what you're doing, is considering that in the context of digitally mediated cultural activity. And this is much more than just giving someone a smartphone and a laptop and assuming things will be okay. Because yes, you do need access to the technology and you need access to the connectivity to participate meaningfully. And meaningfully for me is the key word here. But you also need to feel that you have enough confidence as you take on these things. You need to have the skills to use whatever technology is sitting between you and the experience, and you need to have the motivation. You actually need to want to do it. And that speaks to me about the idea of becoming an audience. That if we're going to create sort of digital artifacts which represent cultural activities, then we need an audience for them. And in the physical world, we spend a lot of time thinking about how we make audiences. I went to a talk a couple of years back by the architect Steve Tompkins, who's well known for having redesigned the Young Vic Theatre in London and the Everyman Theatre in Liverpool. And he said something very profound in terms of how he designed, or him and his team designed this space. And they said that the foyer of a theatre is a place where a crowd becomes an audience. And that really struck me. And he talked through the things he tried to do in the design of Everyman to make that funneling process of being in the bar, being in the foyer, and then coming through into the auditorium, feel like crossing a threshold, changing your state, this liminal experience. And I want to put the challenge to all of us, which is, what is the digital equivalent of that? How do we make people feel like they're an audience online? I'm speaking to you now, and it's incredibly difficult to get a sense of you as my audience. Because what I've got is my presentation, my face. Down the right, I can see 4 or 5 of you. If I try to see more of you, it distracts from the presentation I'm giving. If I scroll, it becomes obvious to you. So I'm having to pay attention to a little green dot just there, this green dot, and act. Now, I have an advantage over many people, which is I've been a radio broadcaster for 30 years. So I'm used to sitting in a quiet room, speaking to myself and imagining and conjuring an audience from that experience and having a sense of who I'm talking to. But I know that many of my colleagues find it really, really difficult. It's something which comes with experience, but it's not something which is sort of commonly taught. And we disregard it at our peril, because we end up then creating experiences which do not work because they're not actually in front of an audience, they're just on a screen. Oops, that's Steve again. Let's go on. Why is that happening? Oh, well. So I said towards the start that it's not just about connectivity. And I'd like to emphasize that in a bit like the way Rebecca was saying with the IAPs. There's a lot of stuff you don't need to put in an IAP, right? It's just, well, I don't think that it's the role of cultural organizations to deliver connectivity. It's someone else's job. To encourage the delivery of connectivity, yes, but the actual delivery of connectivity is something that requires political will and also quite a lot of cash. The Web Foundation has estimated through the Alliance for the Affordable Internet that it would cost $428 billion over 10 years to get everyone online with a quality broadband connection. Now that's only £116 a person, $116 a person, but it's probably not something that's in any of your budget lines. And so I don't think it should be the key factor. What is important is to ensure that, given the reality of people's connectivity today, that you take that into account. That the focus becomes on making a cultural experience which is meaningful, that looks at the skills, the confidence, and the motivation of audiences, and also ensures that the technologies that are available to them will allow them to experience what you plan to have them experience. That doesn't necessarily mean trying to do something for everyone. Over the weekend, I was fortunate enough to participate in DREAM, which is the Royal Shakespeare Company's new experiment in interactive, I suppose you'd call it interactive theatre, in interactive something. They realised a short scene based on Midsummer Night's Dream with Puck, which was done using real-time motion capture of the performers in a space which allowed that, then rendered in real time using something called Unreal Engine into an interactive experience, and with audience participation. Several 100 members of the audience could drop little virtual fireflies into the scene. And it was a high-end experience. So your computer had to be powerful enough, your network connection had to be fast enough, your browser had to be the latest version. So the first thing you saw when you entered this was this screen, basically saying, you may not be worthy. Now, that is very exclusive, but it's also honest about, we're trying to do something here, which is an experiment, and not everyone will be able to experience it yet. If it works, other people will. And what you got, when you got through that barrier, was a really interesting experience. I think they did something remarkable, and it was very brave of Alice and the team there to do what's essentially R&D in the open. But then they also did something which I was really impressed by, which is that they did performances in different times. So they did a 2 a.m. performance so that audiences in Tokyo could get access to it. So that's the volume space they were using. And this is Sarah on Facebook talking about this. So they thought about accessibility, if like, at 90 degrees. It wasn't, oh, everyone can get to experience this, because they clearly can't. It is, let's maximize the number of people who will experience it by moving around the world so that it is convenient for people who can get into it. And I thought that was really quite impressive. At the lower end, you might think that one of the things that is accessible to everyone is just a straightforward website. I chose this one, the Lithuanian National Drama Theatre, obviously just because Vilnius. I didn't pick on it particularly, but what I did do was I ran it through a web accessibility checker, and this is what I found. So at the lowest level, not getting things right according to basic standards. Yeah, and there's a whole load of stuff in there. And most of those errors are things that most people would not notice at all, because they are about accessibility. They're about what happens when you try to access that site through a screen reader, or using technology to enhance accessibility and stuff like that. And it's interesting that I think there needs to be that sorting out the low-level stuff. And you need to sort it out not just because it's the right thing to do for audiences, but because there are potential consequences of not doing it. There's a lawsuit going on in the States at the moment because the American with Disabilities Act indicates that if you don't put particularly tags on images to describe them, then you could be in legal jeopardy. So there's work going on, if you like, to inform people of the basics of accessibility. And this is the sort of questions that people can ask themselves as they start to design products or design work that has a digital element. You know, you can ask yourself at the very start of the design stage, what sort of bandwidth do we need for this? What sort of devices are we going to assume people have? What types of interaction will be offered, and therefore what support needs to be made for them? What do we expect of our audiences? You know, one of the big questions for many organizations at the moment is whether an experience should be mobile first or mobile friendly. In other words, whether you should prioritize the shiny black pebbles that we all have, or whether you should just make it accessible to those, but think about people with laptops. And just as you make tech decisions in a theater, just as you make tech decisions when you're planning a parade or a public event, just as you make tech decisions about the lighting in a gallery, so these tech decisions will significantly impact the future form of the event, but also crucially, they will have implications for the inclusivity of that event. And they need, therefore, I think, to be done at a very early stage in the process, and to be locked in, to make decisions about, well, actually, this is going to be a fairly high-end production, and therefore it is not going to be accessible to people who don't have a smartphone that's less than 3 years old. And it's always reasonable to say that if you can justify it, if it makes sense, given what you're trying to achieve. Or you can say, we want this to be accessible to absolutely everybody, and therefore we need to think about, what does absolutely everybody mean in this context? Does it mean people with an old sort of Nokia phone, it's not even a smartphone? What would you do to give them access to that? And once you've decided that, if like you set the boundaries on your inclusivity, on the digital inclusivity, and then you can design around that and deliver your outcomes. The danger is asking these questions towards the end of the process means you've inadvertently made decisions that might be very exclusive and that might make it difficult for people and can be almost impossible to fix. Now, one of the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic has been that a lot of people are thinking about this as well as you. I found a lot of inspiration in what's happening in education and classrooms at the moment. This is a report from Future Lab in the UK, and it talks about, sort of how to do collaboration in classroom, particularly when some students may have very limited access to the network, may have limited digital skills, may have families who are not supportive. And there's material in that around working around this. Some of it is straightforward stuff, like if you do have an experience, try to make it possible to have it asynchronously as well as synchronously. In other words, record things and make the recordings available. If people are going to be engaging with you and you want them to interact, then provide alternative channels for that interaction, so that if the main method fails, there's some sort of fallback. There's a phrase in the technology world of degrade gracefully, which is when something starts to fall over in technology, it shouldn't just all crash, the Windows blue screen of death. Functionality should be diminished gradually, but you should still try to keep on going. It's actually, I've just realized, it's the analogy of the show must go on, right? So degrading gracefully is my version of the show must go on, which is have a plan for when things don't work so that you can carry on providing something instead of just abandoning it. Most concerts these days don't get abandoned because it's raining, even if they're outdoors, because we've made adaptations to stop people getting electrocuted on stage. What are the equivalent things that you can do for your online experiences to do that? So, recording is one. Putting stuff up in advance, if you can make it available in advance, so people have the opportunity to download things. Minimizing the bandwidth and connectivity requirements. This is one thing just from sort of sessions that I've done myself. Can you find ways where people can spend time enjoying the experience but not being online or not even being in front of the screen? And these are all artistic decisions, fundamentally, but based around the capabilities, the affordances of the technology. And it takes us from accessibility, from, yes, you can get to this, to inclusivity. The idea that not just people can hear what you're saying, can be there for the art, but actually you're thinking about them as an audience and they're invited to become an audience. So it's not about a specific need or problem, it's the set of tools and capabilities that are available to you that allow you to build the art you want to build and reach the audiences you want to reach. Sorry, another screen. You have to understand the accessibility requirements first, but then they just become part of your normal practice. One technology company that's done this enormously well, I think, in the last few years, has really taken this seriously, is Microsoft. And they have a wealth of materials on accessibility. They define 6 axes around vision and hearing, neurodiversity, learning, mobility, and mental health. And this permeates all of their products, like all of them. And it shows what an organization can do when it takes it seriously. And what it starts to provide is a set of platforms on which it is possible to deliver not just PowerPoint presentations, but cultural experiences based on this. So you can move in. And we see that in practice. So we've seen a lot of work with accessibility in real world galleries at the moment. So the Smithsonian Institution has its app to help to provide, if you like, a visual, an auditory guide to the gallery space. And they've moved that online as well. So you can have a tour of the gallery, which is designed for someone who has limited vision or maybe blind, and it still works for you. And I think that's a really nice example. We've seen examples where museums, like this is the V&A in London, are printing out 3D models of their artifacts to allow them to be handled, to be touched, not just by children, but again by people who may have poor vision. 3D printing isn't a pervasive technology yet, but it is an available technology, particularly in educational institutions. And it's something to consider, making objects that can be distributed, if you like, over the internet and then available to audiences in spaces like educational settings might be an effective way to enhance the inclusiveness of the experience without actually having to physically travel. And we have, for example, at the Guggenheim, tours for visitors who are blind or with low vision, which are again taken away. One example which really struck me, however, was a reinvention of a piece called As Far as Isolation Goes. So this is Tanya Al-Khoury in conversation with Basil Zara. And it's about Zara's experience as traveling from a Syrian refugee camp. And the work, as imagined in the gallery space, involves a one-on-one experience where somebody sits and puts their arm through a hole in the wall. And then Basil Zara manipulates their arm, talks to them while doing it, touches them, and draws on their arm, on their skin, using a marker pen, representing the journey. Now, you might think, how do you possibly take that online? Well, As Far as Isolation Goes online has been touring, I suppose is the way to put it, as a one-on-one digital experience, where what you get is a conversation with Basil Zara, and he then asks you to draw on your own arm. So he tells you what to draw. And you know, it's a different experience, but it's capturing the essence of the art. It's capturing the thing which they were trying, that Tanya and Basil were trying to communicate in their work as an intimate, tactile and auditory encounter. Not in this sense through a gallery wall, but by almost putting your hand into the screen and having it changed, having your arm changed without your will, sort of by someone else. You're transformed into a piece where you draw yourself. And I think it's a lovely example of how you can just think creatively about the possibilities of taking something into a new space. And then there's lovely little works like Coney, Tassel Stevens at Coney did this piece called Telephone, which is exploring the history of communication through Zoom and phones. and just trying to be playful with an exploration of what the technology can do. And this is part of, I think, an attempt to make people open to the digital experience as art, rather than the digital experience as work or education, and then make them more receptive to be audiences for other things which take things in a different direction. The other place where I think there's some real inspiration to be found is in the world of gaming and games. This is a photograph of the Xbox adaptive controller, and it's designed for people who have physical disabilities who can't use one of the standard controllers. And it is basically a programmable device. You can define what each of the pads does. You can create it such that it is usable by you if you have limited mobility or only have one limb, or there are all sorts of possibilities here if you have tremor, for example. So you can use this device with the games that people love to play them. And again, Microsoft have produced quite a large body of work on how to make games accessible using this device and others. And I think when we think about digital inclusion in the arts, think about games as an art form, a position I'm prepared to defend when we come to talk later, we should be taking these seriously because they have already done so much in this area. And even from the straightforward stuff like providing subtitles, fine, okay, but then what do I want my subtitles to look like? What font would I like them in? How big do I want them? What colors do I want them? What's their background color? You know, if I need subtitles, but I have poor visual acuity, how do I make them prominent? At the moment we think, oh, you just turn subtitles on, you know, if you're making a video, you go to YouTube, use the subtitling tool, it'll be fine. But it isn't, it's a step. And so we can do that. And we can start to explore, if you like, some of the possibilities also, if you think about a game is a work of art experienced within technology, to do some other more imaginative things. And one of the most fun evenings I had last year in lockdown was a party in a Google spreadsheet. My friend Marie Fulstrom, and I'll send you the link to this, organized a party in a number of linked spreadsheet pages where you logged in and you basically typed and pasted GIFs, and we spent 4 hours having fun in a spreadsheet, which is not something I ever thought I'd ever say. So look out for the stuff that's on the, if like, the leading edge or the bleeding edge as well, and it will help. The last group of people we should be thinking about when we come to look at how we can enhance the inclusivity of our art and our cultural activity is what companies are now doing. Because the companies themselves have a lot to lose if they can't support their customers. So they're thinking very hard about what they need to do to enhance the quality of experience, to make this Zoom call something more. Yeah. And we know Zoom are doing this, we know Microsoft are doing it with Teams. There's a lot of work going on in there in the big companies. There are also a lot of what are called decentralized technologies out there, which are trying to break the hold that the big organizations like Google, Facebook, Microsoft have over the network. And they have some innovative product and tools out there as well that you might want to think about for things like hosting chat. They normally require a bit more technological hand-holding than something which you can just get off the shelf, but it's worth looking at them. And then we look at some of the big ambitions. So this is a concept from Microsoft, or what Microsoft Teams might look like if you had a big enough screen. And I saw this and was really intrigued at the possibilities of this sort of virtual space being used as a performance space. And so when looking for inspiration and ideas, I think there's a wide range of places. There's existing cultural institutions, obviously, many of them trying to do a lot. There are the companies themselves. There's education. And again, I would emphasize again, there's what's happening in the world of gaming. Once we have an idea about what the technical landscape looks like, once you've chosen a delivery platform, once you know what you're doing, you then have the very hard job of asking what art you want to make in this space, about who your audience is and what they can experience from it, what they'll get. and what is feasible within those technical capabilities. And that will change. In the end, it's about making art that will engage people through this veil of technology, through these barriers. And that may mean rethinking what you're trying to do, as we saw with I've got his name. Honestly, sorry. As far as isolation goes, I want to say as far as my fingertips go, that may mean rethinking the artwork itself, or more likely it would mean designing it from the ground up with an understanding of the technology. But in the end, it's going to come down to you as practitioners, the companies you work with, the organizations, to make sure that we can take advantage of the capabilities of these technologies. And that, in a sense, is the art. There are no straightforward or easy answers here. There has to be the desire to do it, the desire to engage with people, use through these digital tools and technologies. If that desire is there, then I think there's a lot that you can do. So to summarize my thoughts, I don't think it's up to you to deliver access, but coping with the consequences of access is, up to a point. That, as with everything, that needs to start with the audience, and in the design process, think about how you can reduce those barriers. But there is a lot of good practice outside arts and culture. And in the end, it should be the art that comes through. It should be the cultural experience that people remember, not the technology that delivered it or facilitated it or got in the way. And that's the real challenge for you. And lastly, if this all seems a bit overwhelming, let this comfort you. Imagine how much work it took to take this photograph, which is the first high-resolution photograph of a sunset on Mars. Thank you.
What a beautiful image.
I know.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you.